In the early summer of 1941, the world watched as Nazi Germany unleashed the largest invasion in human history, Operation Barbarossa. Hitler believed that the Soviet Union would collapse in just a few weeks. His generals were confident, their tanks had crushed every nation in Europe, and their soldiers believed they were unstoppable. But as the German forces swept deeper into Soviet territory, strange reports began to reach Berlin. Soldiers on the front lines claimed to have seen a new kind of Soviet tank, something faster, stronger, and almost impossible to destroy. At first, the High Command dismissed these stories as battlefield exaggerations, the kind of panic that comes from exhaustion and confusion. Yet the evidence grew impossible to ignore. Wrecked German tanks lay scattered while Soviet machines continued to advance through gunfire and explosions. Engineers sent to inspect the battlefield found a chilling discovery. These new Soviet tanks were nothing like the crude machines Germany had expected. They were advanced, resilient, and terrifyingly effective. Hitler had believed that the Soviet Union was weak, that its industry was too backward to challenge German technology. But he was wrong. Behind the smoke of war, the Soviets had been building something far more dangerous than a tank. What the Germans had discovered was not just a new weapon of war, but a new symbol of resistance, a machine that would shatter the illusion of Nazi superiority and change the direction of the conflict forever. For years, the Germans had relied on their panzers to dominate Europe, sleek, efficient, and precise. These tanks represented German engineering at its peak. They had rolled through Poland, France, and the Balkans with terrifying speed, crushing everything in their path. But in the vast fields of the Soviet Union, that confidence began to fade. German shells that once pierced armor effortlessly now bounced off the steel of an unfamiliar Soviet design. Troops watched in disbelief as their bullets ricocheted uselessly from the sloped armor of enemy tanks. When engineers examined the wreckage, they realized they were facing a machine unlike anything seen before. The T-34. It was revolutionary, with armor designed to deflect shells rather than absorb them. Its cannon could destroy German tanks from distances they thought safe. Even more shocking was its mobility. It crossed muddy terrain, deep snow, and rough hills where German vehicles stalled or broke down. The T-34 was not only stronger, it was smarter in every aspect of design. And it had been mass-produced in secret, in factories hidden deep inside the Soviet heartland. As these tanks poured onto the battlefield, the Germans realized they were facing a nightmare they had never planned for. For the first time since the war began, Hitler's army was not advancing. It was struggling to survive. The T-34 had exposed the one truth the Nazis refused to believe. The Soviets were not just fighting for survival. They were fighting to outsmart and outlast the Reich. The birth of the T-34 was not an accident. It was a response to years of humiliation and loss. After World War I, the Soviet Union studied every failure of its armies and every success of its enemies. Its leaders knew another great war was inevitable, and this time they refused to be unprepared. In secret factories, Soviet engineers and designers worked tirelessly, often in freezing conditions, to create a tank that could survive anything the battlefield threw at it. They learned from other nations but never copied them. Instead, they asked a simple question: what kind of machine could survive Russia itself? Its mud, snow, ice, and endless distances. The answer was the T-34. It combined speed, protection, and simplicity in a way no other tank had. Its wide tracks gave it unmatched grip on soft ground. Its sloped armor reduced weight but increased defense. And its gun, the powerful 76.2 mm, could pierce German tanks before they even reached firing range. By the time Hitler invaded, thousands of T-34s were already being produced in secret. The Germans thought they were attacking a weak nation, but they were really walking into an industrial trap. The Soviets had turned their land into a war factory. Every piece of steel, every bolt, every engine part was built for one purpose: survival. The T-34 was not just a tank. It was the physical embodiment of a nation's determination to endure and fight back, no matter the cost. When German troops first encountered the T-34 in battle, their reactions were filled with disbelief and fear. Reports flooded in describing shells bouncing off the armor, engines roaring through fire, and tanks that refused to die. Commanders who had once mocked the Soviet army were now sending desperate requests for stronger weapons. The T-34 was faster than any German tank and could fight in conditions that crippled others. Snow, mud, and freezing temperatures meant nothing to it. Soldiers who tried to stop them with grenades or explosives often watched the tanks keep moving, as if unstoppable. Word spread quickly across the German front lines. The Russians had a super tank. When captured, T-34s were finally examined. German engineers were stunned by what they found. It was simple, but brilliant. The armor was angled to deflect incoming fire. The tracks were wide enough to handle any terrain. The diesel engine reduced fire risk. Everything about it was practical, efficient, and built for war. Hitler, furious and humiliated, demanded that German engineers copy and surpass it. But they could not. The German tanks were too complex, too delicate, and too expensive to produce in large numbers. The T-34, however, was the opposite. It was the tank of the people. It could be built fast, repaired easily, and sent back into battle within days. In that simplicity lay its genius, and in that genius, the fate of the Eastern Front began to change forever. As winter set in during 1941, the full power of the T-34 became clear. While German tanks froze in the bitter cold, their engines cracking under the icy wind, the Soviet machines kept moving. They rolled through snow and ice with engines roaring like living beasts. The Germans had entered a world they did not understand. Their oil thickened, their guns jammed, and their soldiers froze. But the T-34 was built for this land. It thrived in the very environment that destroyed others. Soviet crews slept beside their tanks, wrapped in blankets, ready to fight at dawn. Their morale grew as they realized they finally had a weapon that could stand against the invaders. The Germans, who once believed themselves unstoppable, began to fear the sound of those engines in the distance. Every rumble on the horizon meant death could be near. The Soviets used the terrain as an ally, drawing the Germans deeper into the cold, waiting for the moment to strike. The T-34 was not just surviving, it was teaching the enemy a brutal lesson. Hitler's war machine, built on arrogance and speed, could not defeat the endurance of a nation fighting for its very existence. The frozen plains of Russia became a graveyard for the panzers, and the T-34 became a symbol of revenge. It was here, in the snow, that Germany's dream of quick victory began to die, buried under the steel tracks of the Soviet tank that refused to stop. By early 1942, German engineers were working day and night to design something that could fight back. They studied the captured T-34s in detail, taking them apart piece by piece, trying to understand how such a machine had outclassed them. Out of this effort came the Panther tank, Germany's answer to the T-34. It was powerful, sleek, and deadly, but also complicated. Every Panther that left the factory took far longer to build than a T-34. When it worked, it was formidable. But when it broke down, it could take days to repair. The T-34, by comparison, could be fixed in hours by the crew themselves. Hitler believed that better technology would always win, yet war had changed. It was no longer about perfection. It was about who could build more, faster, and keep fighting. The Soviets understood this better than anyone. Entire cities were turned into tank factories, where men and women worked day and night under bombing raids. They produced thousands of T-34s, each one ready for the front. Every destroyed tank was quickly replaced. Every loss was temporary. While Germany focused on building masterpieces, the Soviet Union built an army of steel. By the time the Panther appeared in large numbers, it was already too late. The tide of war had shifted, and no matter how strong Germany's new machines were, they could not match the endless stream of T-34s rolling from the east. The machine built for survival had become the machine of victory. As the war dragged on, the T-34 evolved with it. Newer models rolled out of the factories with stronger guns and thicker armor. The 85mm cannon turned it into a true predator on the battlefield, capable of destroying even the heaviest German tanks. Soviet tank commanders became legends, leading daring charges through smoke and chaos. The Germans called them Stalin's steel wolves. Wherever the T-34 appeared, fear followed. It was not just its power. It was the way it kept coming. No matter how many were destroyed, more would arrive. The Soviets had turned production into a weapon. The workers back home were fighting their own war, racing against time, building tanks faster than the Germans could destroy them. Each T-34 carried more than ammunition. It carried the hope of millions. By 1944, these tanks were no longer defending. They were advancing. They thundered westward, pushing the Germans back through villages and forests once conquered. The same roads that had seen Nazi triumph now echoed with Soviet victory. German soldiers who once looked down on their enemy now stared in disbelief, as endless waves of steel crushed everything in their path. The T-34 had become more than a tank. It was a force of nature, rolling forward with the will of an entire nation behind it. What began as a desperate effort to survive had transformed into a movement of unstoppable momentum that would not end until Berlin itself fell. By 1945, the T-34 was everywhere. From the ruins of Stalingrad to the streets of Berlin, it became the face of Soviet power. Its tracks carved through the heart of Nazi territory, each mile gained paid for with courage and sacrifice. The German army, once feared across Europe, now fought a losing battle against an enemy it had underestimated. Soviet tank divisions moved like waves, coordinated, relentless, and full of purpose. The roar of their engines filled the air as cities burned and walls crumbled. Hitler's dream of domination was collapsing piece by piece, under the weight of the very war he had unleashed. In Berlin, soldiers whispered about the red tide approaching from the east. They knew what it meant. The T-34 had become the symbol of retribution. When they finally rolled into the German capital, these tanks represented more than victory. They represented justice for millions who had suffered under Nazi rule. To the world, the T-34 was proof that the Soviet Union could rise from near destruction and strike back with unstoppable force. Its steel body carried the story of a nation that refused to surrender. And when the final battle ended, it stood not just as a weapon of war, but as a monument to endurance. The T-34 had done more than win battles. It had changed the very meaning of power in modern warfare, proving that true strength lies not in perfection, but in persistence. When the war finally ended, the T-34 did not fade away. Instead, it became the most influential tank design in history. Dozens of countries adopted it, either through Soviet support or direct copies. From Eastern Europe to Asia, from Korea to the Middle East, the T-34 became the armored backbone of revolutions and wars long after Hitler was gone. It was simple, reliable, and deadly. Mechanics could repair it with basic tools, and soldiers trusted it more than any new machine that came later. For many nations rebuilding after years of destruction, the T-34 was more than a weapon. It was a symbol of survival, a reminder that strength could rise from ruin. When the Cold War began, these same tanks stood watch across the Iron Curtain, facing west, guarding the Soviet sphere. Even as technology advanced, the T-34 remained ready. It fought in Korea, in Vietnam, in Africa, always carrying with it the legacy of the Eastern Front. For a generation of soldiers who never saw World War II, the T-34 was still a teacher, showing them what determination and courage could build. It had started as a desperate creation of wartime necessity, but it became an icon of resilience. And while newer tanks would replace it, none would ever carry the same weight of history. The T-34 did not just win a war, it shaped the world that came after it. One battle, one revolution, and one victory at a time. Behind every T-34 stood not just engineers, but ordinary people who made the impossible happen. Women, children, and elderly workers in Soviet factories built these tanks under constant danger. Bombers roared above their heads, while they welded steel plates and assembled engines. Food was scarce, warmth was rare, but the spirit of survival burned brighter than any fire. They worked without rest because they knew that every tank they finished could save lives on the front. Many of them never saw the battlefield, yet their contribution was just as vital as those who fought. Entire families devoted themselves to the war effort, turning factories into fortresses of hope. When Soviet soldiers saw a new T-34 arriving at the front, they saw more than metal. They saw the faces of those who built it, the determination of a nation standing behind them. This unity was something the Nazis never understood. They fought for conquest, while the Soviets fought for existence. That difference gave the T-34 its true power. Every weld, every bolt, carried the weight of that shared purpose. It was not just a machine of war. It was a machine of survival, built by a people who refused to disappear. And when victory finally came, the T-34 became their proof. It stood for everyone who gave everything so that the world could one day see peace again. Its steel might have aged, but its story never would. As decades passed, the legend of the T-34 only grew. Veterans spoke of it with pride, and historians called it one of the greatest tanks ever built. Museums preserved it, filmmakers recreated its battles, and its image became a symbol of defiance. In towns once destroyed by war, old T-34s were placed on stone pedestals as monuments to sacrifice. Children climbed them, veterans saluted them, and nations remembered through them. The world had seen many tanks since then, faster, stronger, more advanced, but none had the same soul. The T-34 represented more than victory. It represented courage under fire and hope in despair. For the Soviet people, it was a reminder that they had faced the darkest moment in history and endured. And for the world, it showed how design, purpose, and resilience could turn the tide of a global war. Even countries that once fought against it came to respect it. German engineers who studied it after the war admitted that its design changed their understanding of armored warfare. The T-34 influenced every tank that followed, setting a standard that few could surpass. Today, long after its guns have fallen silent, the T-34 remains one of the most recognizable symbols of World War II, a steel survivor that carried the hopes, fears, and strength of an entire generation. Its story did not end with the war. It continued as a living reminder of what determination can achieve, even in the face of destruction. Looking back now, the T-34 is more than just a machine from history. It is a lesson carved in steel. It teaches that greatness is not always born from perfection, but from purpose. It reminds us that technology alone does not win wars. People do. Every rivet and scar on its armor tells a story of sacrifice. It stands for the factory workers who never stopped, the soldiers who never gave up, and a nation that refused to break. The Germans had better designs on paper, but the Soviets had something stronger: belief. That belief rolled on metal tracks, across snow and mud, through smoke and fire, until the enemy fell. When historians speak of the Eastern Front, they speak of endurance, and at the heart of that endurance stands the T-34. It turned the tide of World War II, reshaped the idea of modern warfare, and defined the willpower of a people fighting for their land. Even now, when one of these old tanks appears in parades or films, it commands silence and respect. It represents the moment when the impossible became possible. The T-34 is not just remembered, it is immortal. Its roar still echoes through history, reminding us that even in the darkest times, resilience can become the greatest weapon of all. The tank that was built in desperation became the machine that changed the fate of nations. And that, above all, is why the world will never forget the T-34.